Good evening, everyone. Hope everybody's doing well this evening. Well, we're continuing on our study in 1 Corinthians. We're up to chapter 14. And we'll go through chapter 14 today and then move on to the next chapter. This chapter, the objectives in studying this chapter, and it's kind of a provocative chapter in a sense because a lot of denominations use this to support some of the things they do in church when it's really more of a misunderstanding of this. So understanding this chapter is very important. So the first objective is to understand the proper use of tongues, especially their use in the assembly. Also, to understand the principles which are to govern the assembly of the church. And the summary of the chapter goes this way. In this chapter, Paul concludes his discussion of spiritual gifts. In comparing the gift of prophesying to that of speaking in tongues, he points out that prophesying excels when it comes to the edification of the church. In fact, unless the speaking of tongues provides a new revelation or a teaching and is properly interpreted, it does little good. Actually probably ends up doing more harm because it's not proper. Then it's designed to convince unbelievers. Improper use of speaking in tongues in the assembly can even bring reproach on the church. So the purpose of tongues was to actually save people, convince unbelievers. Okay? And the next part is, therefore, Paul regulates the proper use of spiritual gifts in the assembly with a series of instructions, including commandments from the Lord about the place of women. So we'll go through the outline of the chapter and beginning with the first verse, and we're going to talk about spiritual gifts and prophesying and the speaking of tongues. Okay, so the first 5 verses deals with prophesying versus speaking in tongues. Okay. A call to love, but also a spiritual gift, especially the gift of prophecy. Speaking in tongues, as done at Corinth, is speaking to God and is speaking mysteries, whereas prophesying edifies, exhorts, and comforts others. Speaking in tongues, as done at Corinth, was not edifying the church, thus the desire that they had gifts of prophecy more than the gifts of tongues. Speaking in tongues was doing the congregation no good whatsoever in Corinth. And then verses 6 through 19 talks about using tongues in a profitable way. Without a revelation, knowledge, prophecy, or teaching, speaking in tongues profit nothing. That's verse 6. Like playing an instrument without giving any distinction in the sounds. Without interpretation, it is no better than a foreigner speaking to you. Just like you tried to listen to something, and you've seen movies with subtitles where they're speaking in a different language, you wouldn't understand a thing they're saying without the translation down below. So it's just, without interpretation, it's no better than a foreigner talking to you. And that's 10 and 11. Therefore, the admonitions. To excel in the area of edifying the church. That's what we need to do. For those who speak in tongues, to pray that they may be able to interpret. So without interpretation, the speaking of tongues does no good. It actually does damage. And to be able to pray and sing with both the spirit and the understanding, that all might be edified. That's 14 through 19, where it talks about positive edification. Now, another comparison between tongues and prophesying, and that's in verses 20 through 25. Tongues are used for signs for unbelievers, while prophesying is used for believers. So the purpose of tongues is bringing new people into the church. Tongues in the assembly, without interpreters, will give people the wrong impression. That's verse 23. But prophesying in the assembly can bless even the unbeliever and uninformed person. So in other words, prophesying has value for everybody in the church. Now, verses 26 through 40 talks about spiritual gifts, regulating their use. Verse 26 says, "Let all things be done for edification." This is the purpose of this, all these spiritual gifts. They're done for edifying. 27 and 28 talks about regulating the use of tongues. 2 or 3 may speak in turn, let one interpret. That's if necessary. If there's no interpreter, keep silent in the church. Now, verses 29 through 33 talks about the regulating of the use of prophesying. 2 or 3 prophets may speak, and others may discern. To be done in turn, they all may learn, for the spirit of the prophets are subject to the prophets. God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, and in all churches. And that's verse 33. Now, 34 through 38, regulating the place of women in the assembly. In verse 34, it says they're to keep silent in the assemblies. Let them ask husbands at home if they have any questions, for it is shameful for women to speak in the church. And that's in verse 35. These commandments of the Lord, which must be recognized as such. And that's verses 36 through 38. Now, his final comments are 39 and 40. The desire to prophesy, and do not forbid to speak in tongues. Again, purpose of tongues for unbelievers only if there's interpreter. Let all things be done decently and in order. And that's verse 40. Okay, so let's look at the questions and review them for this chapter. The first question is the main points of this chapter. The first main point was prophesying and speaking in tongues, and then the second part of the chapter was regulating their use. Question number 2, as being practiced at Corinth, what did the speaking in tongues accomplish? Verses 2 and 4, it only edified the speaker. It was of no benefit to anyone else. Question number 3, what is the value of prophesying? And that's in verse 3, and it says providing edification, exhortation, and comfort. Quite a difference. Edifying the speaker only, or bringing edification and comfort to all. Question number 4, what is the necessity for speaking in tongues? What is necessary for speaking in tongues to be of value in the assembly? Question number 6, and we were clear on this one, it must provide revelation, knowledge, prophecy, or teaching, and have someone to interpret. What is the purpose of speaking in tongues? And this is verse 22. To serve as a sign to unbelievers. So the only purpose of tongues is for the unbelievers. This is according to Paul in this Corinthian letter. Okay, the next question, question number 6. What restrictions does Paul place on speaking in tongues in the assembly? 27-28. It said it must be 2 and no more than 3. So in other words, if just one person is speaking in tongues, that's wrong. It must be 2, and if there's 4 people, that's wrong. No more than 3. And it must have an interpreter, or those speaking in tongues are to remain silent. Okay, and this is question number 7. What restrictions does Paul place on women in the assembly? And that's 34 and 35, and that is to be silent. Question number 8. What 2 basic principles are to govern the assembly of the church? And that's verse 26 and verse 40. The first one, it must be edifying. All things are done for edification. Second, it must be done decently and in order. It's expected that the assembly is a very orderly and decent event. So that's this chapter. I want to expound a little bit on the women being silent, and it is also recognized that being silent really means one of the reasons to be silent is not to usurp the authority of a man. The man has always been head of the house, and I'm going to tell you right now, anything that a woman, especially a married woman, has to say, she has a husband, it can be discussed there, and if it's something that needs to be brought up, it's very easy for the man to bring it up in a discussion with the other men. But this is kind of a sore subject in a lot of churches. This by no means reduces the power or the importance of a woman in the church. I guarantee you there are more things taught, especially rearing of children, about the Lord by women than by men, for the most part. I'm telling you right now, it's just that they're not to take charge or be in control of the service. And that's the only real stipulation that I can see with it. There is nothing that prevents a woman from evangelizing on a one-to-one basis or anything else. This is talking about in the assembly. And I think one of the reasons is for this was the decent and orderly thing. Too many different things going on causes confusion. This is one of those things that keep it simple, to the point, scriptural, and sound. So I want to thank you very much for your attention. Next week we'll go on to chapter 15. I appreciate all of your listening to the message and continue to stay faithful in studying. And pretty quick we'll be through 1 Corinthians. Thank you very much for your attention and have a wonderful evening. And God bless you.